The text came in at 11 at night while I was sitting in my truck outside the Piggly Wiggly in Houma, Louisiana, trying to figure out how I was going to cover the $412 still owed on my daughter's orthodontist bill before the 15th of the month. It was from a man named Dale Renner, a tool pusher I had worked under on a platform out past Grand Isle 6 years earlier, and it said only that he had a job if I still knew how to keep my mouth shut and my hands steady. I called him back before I had even finished reading it twice, because 8 months of hauling scrap steel for $11 an hour had a way of making pride feel like a luxury I could no longer afford. Things had not been easy since Renee and I split 2 years back, and between the truck payment, the apartment in Houma, and the child support I was already behind on, I had gotten used to the particular exhaustion of numbers that never quite added up, no matter how I arranged them on the page. Dale told me a private buyer had picked up an old fixed platform called Triton Alpha, sitting about 110 miles south of Port Fortune in about 600 feet of water, and wanted a small crew to recommission it before the new operator moved equipment out in the spring. He said the pay was $18,000 a month, paid every 2 weeks, with a signing bonus of $5,000 wired the day I showed up at the dock. And for a man 3 months behind on child support, that number did something to my chest I was not proud of. I asked him why a job like that paid nearly triple what Fortune Marine was offering for comparable work on active platforms, and he laughed in a way that did not quite reach the rest of what he said. The owners wanted people who would not ask a lot of questions, he told me, and would not need much hand-holding once they were dropped off out there on the open water for weeks at a stretch with no relief crew coming. I asked him straight out, point blank, if there was something actually wrong with the platform itself. Some kind of safety issue nobody wanted written down anywhere in the paperwork he had sent over to me. He was quiet on the line a second longer than felt comfortable before telling me it was just an old platform that had sat idle a long time and needed careful, patient hands to bring it back online safely. That answer should have bothered me more than it did, but I was standing in a grocery store parking lot doing math on my daughter's teeth, and a man in that position tends to hear what he needs to hear rather than what is actually being said to him. I spent that whole night reading over the contract Dale emailed me, a document thinner and vaguer than any offshore agreement I had signed across 15 years of working the water in 3 different states. It was full of clauses about confidentiality and limited communication that would have made me walk away from any normal job posting without giving it a second thought at all. No questions asked of anyone. The company on the letterhead was called Calder Meridian Holdings, out of an address in Lafayette that turned out, when I looked it up later, to belong to a law office rather than an actual oil company, which should have told me something before I ever agreed to anything. Still, the payment terms were clear enough. Half the total deposited the day I arrived on the platform and the remainder paid out on successful completion of the contract, and even walking away halfway through would have left me further ahead than I had been in years. I called Renee the next morning to tell her about the job, choosing my words carefully, since the confidentiality clause forbade me from ever naming either the platform or the company that owned it outright. She asked the obvious question anyone in her position would have asked me, wanting to know why any legitimate outfit would pay that kind of money for routine maintenance work out in the middle of nowhere. I told her I had asked myself the same thing and had not gotten a satisfying answer, but that 4 months of unemployment had taught me satisfying answers were a luxury too, right alongside pride, and that Callie's braces were not going to pay for themselves while I waited around for one. Renee went quiet on her end of the line for a long moment, and then she told me plainly to be careful out there, and to actually call her back when I said I would this time around, without any excuses at all. The last time I had taken remote work of any kind, I had gone 11 days without checking in at all, and she had come close to calling the sheriff's department in 3 separate Louisiana parishes, looking. I promised her I would email regularly since the contract allowed for that much correspondence, and I asked to talk to Callie for a few minutes before I finally hung up the phone that night for good measure. Mostly I just wanted to hear her tell me all about her science project on hurricanes one more time before I disappeared into a job that would keep me from any real conversation with her for weeks at a time. That night, lying awake in my apartment with the signed contract sitting on the kitchen table where I could see it from the couch, I told myself the uneasy feeling in my stomach was nothing more than nerves. It was the kind of thing plenty of offshore men felt before a long hitch out on open water, far from home, and most of them got over it easily enough within the first week once the routine of the work settled in. I drove to Port Fortune 3 days later with a duffel bag, my old hard hat, and a folder of paperwork that Dale had emailed me, leaving Homa before sunrise so I could stop by Renee's place first and say goodbye to Callie in person before the long drive south. Callie was still half asleep in her pajamas when I knelt down by the door, and she made me promise, in that serious way only a 9-year-old can manage, that I would bring her back a shark tooth from wherever I was going. I had told her only that it involved the ocean and nothing else about the actual job itself, since the confidentiality clause in Dale's paperwork left me little real room to say anything more specific. The drive down Highway 1 through the Rose and Golden Meadow felt longer than it should have, the bayou pressing in close on both sides of the road, cypress trees standing half-drowned in still brown water that mirrored a sky already thick with the kind of humidity that promised an ugly afternoon. By the time I reached Port Fortune, the port itself was busy in its usual way. Crew boats and supply vessels lined up along the docks, workers hauling gear and provisions toward platforms with names and destinations that, unlike mine, were printed plainly on the manifests taped to their gangways. I found the address Dale had given me, a small unmarked office trailer near the far end of the port, where I met him in person for the first time in 6 years. His hair grayer than I remembered, and his handshake carrying the same firm, business-like grip he had always used with new hands. Dale introduced me to Marcus Boudreau, a young Derrican from Thibodeau, who could not have been more than 25 years old, lean and quick-moving, with a kind of nervous, restless energy about him that I noticed right away. It was the kind of restless energy that came from someone who needed this particular paycheck badly enough to overlook whatever questions he might otherwise have asked about a strange job like this one. Marcus told me while we loaded gear onto the crew boat that his mother had been in and out of the hospital in Homa for most of the year with a heart condition the family's insurance barely covered. Dale's offer, he said, had shown up at almost exactly the moment he had run out of other options worth seriously considering for a young man still living at home and helping raise his younger siblings. The fourth member of our crew was an older mechanic. Everybody just called Pop, a wiry man in his 60s with forearms roped in old scar tissue and a face that had spent decades weathering offshore sun. He barely said 2 words to any of us while we finished loading gear, and he kept mostly to himself even after the boat finally pulled away from the dock and out toward the open water beyond the jetty. The crew boat captain, a heavy-set man named Emile who ran supply runs for half the companies working out of Fortune, went quiet himself once Dale told him exactly which platform we were headed toward that particular morning, his easy dockside chatter dropping off almost instantly. He spent most of the 2-hour ride watching the horizon instead of making the usual small talk captains like to make with new hands out on their first trip offshore, which struck me as odd at the time, though I said nothing about it to anyone else aboard. About 40 minutes out, with the coastline already a thin gray smudge behind us, he finally spoke, saying only that he had ferried men out to Triton Alpha twice before, years back, and that both times he had been glad when his engines were finally pointed back toward land instead of away from it. I asked him what he meant by a comment like that, and he just shook his head slowly and told me some platforms get a reputation among boat crews the same way certain stretches of highway get one among long-haul truckers, for reasons nobody can name but everybody still feels somehow. Marcus laughed it off as sailor superstition, the kind every crew boat captain seemed to carry about one platform or another, but Pop, sitting near the stern with his eyes fixed on the water, did not laugh at all, and his silence sat with me longer than any joke would have. The platform itself came into view a little after 2 in the afternoon, a rust-streaked skeleton of steel legs rising out of flat green water, its upper deck looking smaller and more fragile than I remembered offshore structures ever looking from a distance out on open water. Dale explained on the ride up the stairs that our job for the first 2 weeks was mostly inspection and light maintenance, checking the wellhead integrity, servicing the generators, and getting the crew quarters livable again after what he guessed was close to a decade sitting idle out there. He was vague about why the platform had been shut in for so long, saying only that the previous operator had gone under financially sometime around 2014 and the wells had simply been left capped, waiting for a buyer who could afford to bring them back online eventually. The crew quarters smelled like standing water and old rust the moment we stepped inside, a smell that clung to the back of my throat for most of that first afternoon no matter how many doors and windows Pop propped open along the narrow gangway leading toward the galley. Dale handed out room assignments off a laminated card, still listing the names of the previous crew, 6 men total, and I noticed 3 of the rooms were marked as never reassigned despite the platform having supposedly sat empty for the better part of 10 years running. I asked him about that discrepancy over dinner, a can of chili heated on the camp stove since the galley range was not yet wired for power, and he just shrugged it off, saying paperwork from the old operator had always been sloppy and nobody had bothered updating any of it properly. Marcus spent that first evening exploring the lower decks all alone with a flashlight, more out of restless curiosity than any actual task Dale had assigned him to finish up before dark fell that day. He came back up talking about how strange it felt walking through rooms that still had personal items scattered around. Coffee mugs and paperback novels left exactly where someone had set them down years ago. Pop said almost nothing during dinner, eating quickly and methodically the way men do when a meal is fuel rather than pleasure. And afterward, he disappeared toward the generator room to start working through a maintenance checklist, longer than anything Dale had described to us back in Fortune. I climbed up to the heli deck a little before sunset, partly to get a signal on my satellite phone, and partly just to be alone with my thoughts for a few minutes after a long day of travel and unfamiliar surroundings pressing in on all sides. The sun went down orange and low over water that stretched flat and empty in every direction. No other platforms visible anywhere on the horizon. No boats. Nothing but the Gulf itself going gold. And then gray and finally black as the light finally gave out completely. I remember standing there on the heli deck thinking that for $18,000 a month, I could put up with almost anything at all out here on the water for a while. And at the time, I genuinely meant it. I had no idea yet how wrong I was about that particular word, or how much of what waited for us below the waterline had been waiting far longer than any of us, or Calder Meridian Holdings, had ever bothered to imagine possible. Marcus found the logbook 2 days in, tucked behind a fire extinguisher bracket in the control room, its pages swollen with old humidity but still mostly legible under the yellow glow of his headlamp in the dim, dusty room. The last entry was dated the 9th of October, and it did not read like the end of a planned shutdown so much as the middle of an ordinary shift that had simply stopped, mid-sentence, with a pressure reading on line 4 and nothing written after it at all. Pop took the book from him without a word, read the last page twice, and then set it down on the console like it had gotten heavier in his hands than a stack of damp paper had any right to be, and he stared at it a while longer. That same night, I woke up a little after 2 in the morning to a sound coming up through the deck plating, a slow rhythmic knocking that seemed to travel through the leg of the platform itself rather than through the ordinary air the way sound usually does. I told myself it was the current working against the risers, something Dale had mentioned platforms did in certain tide conditions, and I mostly believed it right up until the knocking kept exactly the same interval every single night for the rest of that first week. On the 3rd morning, I found Pop already awake in the galley before dawn, standing at the small window with a cup of black coffee he had not touched, watching the water in a way that made me stop in the doorway before saying anything to him at all. When I asked if he had heard the knocking too, he just nodded once, slowly, and told me he had been listening to it every night since we arrived, though he offered nothing further about what he thought it might actually be. Marcus, for his part, seemed to sleep through it entirely, and when I mentioned it to him over breakfast, he laughed and said I had probably just imagined the whole thing after a long day of travel and unfamiliar surroundings pressing in on all sides. I wanted badly to believe him, since a tired imagination was a far more comfortable explanation than anything else my mind kept quietly circling back toward whenever the knocking started up again after midnight, right on schedule. On the 4th day, checking a junction box near the base of the derrick, I noticed something odd about the metal. A strange mottled discoloration spreading across the steel in patterns unlike any rust or corrosion I had seen in 15 years of offshore work. Dale looked at it briefly when I pointed it out and said it was probably just salt damage from years of exposure. An answer that satisfied him enough to move on to the next item on his checklist, without a second glance at the metal itself. I kept thinking about it anyway. The way the discoloration seemed to branch outward from a single point near the base, almost like something had spread there slowly over a long stretch of time, rather than simply corroding the way ordinary weather damage does. 5 days into the job, while helping Marcus clear out a storage locker near the crew quarters, I came across a cardboard box of personal effects left behind by whoever had worked this platform before us. Inside were water-damaged photographs, a paperback Western novel with a broken spine, and a wall calendar still turned to October of the year. Everything apparently stopped happening out here on the water. Someone had circled a date near the end of the month in red marker, no note beside it, just a thick, angry circle pressed hard enough into the paper that it had torn slightly at one edge, and I found myself staring at that circled date longer than made any sense. Marcus held up one of the photographs, 6 men standing in front of the platform's crane in hard hats and coveralls, all of them smiling the easy smile of guys who had just finished a long shift and were glad to be done with it for the day. He asked, half joking, whether any of them were still around, and I told him I honestly did not know, though something about the question sat uneasily with me. The rest of that afternoon while we finished sorting through the rest of the box. That same evening, the platform's old marine radio crackled to life on its own, no one having touched it, filling the control room with a burst of static that resolved, just for a few seconds, into what sounded almost like a voice speaking too quietly to make out any actual words. Dale claimed it was probably interference bouncing off another vessel somewhere out past the horizon, a common enough occurrence on old equipment that had not been properly serviced in years. But he unplugged the radio anyway and did not plug it back in again that night. I asked Marcus if he had noticed anything strange since we first arrived out on the platform, beyond just the knocking that everybody already knew about by then and talked about quietly among ourselves. He admitted, a little sheepishly, that he kept having this strange feeling he had walked this exact hallway before, though he had certainly never once set foot on Triton Alpha in his life until this trip. I told him I understood the feeling better than he probably realized, since I had gotten the same sensation twice already myself, once passing the stairwell to the cellar deck, and one standing at the exact spot on the heli deck where I had watched the sunset that first night. Neither of us had a good explanation for it, and neither of us particularly wanted to keep talking about it once the sky outside the window had gone fully dark and the knocking, right on schedule, started up again somewhere below our feet. On the 4th day, Marcus and I went to inspect the cellar deck below the wellhead, an area Dale had specifically told us not to bother with yet, since it was scheduled for a later phase of the maintenance work still to come. We found a section of grating welded shut where no grating should ever have needed welding at all. The welds rough and uneven, clearly done in a hurry by somebody without much real skill at the actual work. They ran in an uneven ring around what looked like an access hatch leading down toward the conductor pipes beneath the main deck. A hatch that, by every normal standard, should have simply had a bolted cover rather than a crude weld sealing it permanently shut. Marcus asked Dale about it that evening and got a longer explanation than the logbook had ever earned us, something about a safety incident years back that had prompted the previous operator to seal off an unstable section instead of properly repairing it the right way. It was a reasonable enough answer on its own, the kind of thing that happens on old platforms more often than companies like to admit publicly. But something about the careful way Dale delivered it made me feel like he had rehearsed the words before either of us ever asked him the question. Pop, for his part, had started sleeping with a flashlight and a wrench within arm's reach of his bunk, a habit I noticed on the 5th night when I passed his open door on the way to the head and saw both items laid out with obvious care. I asked him straight out the next morning if he had worked this platform before, back when it was still called something else under an earlier operator, and for a long moment he just kept scraping rust off a valve handle without looking up at me at all. Eventually he said that he had, once, briefly, a long time ago, and that he had asked to be reassigned after only 3 weeks despite it being the best-paying contract he had ever taken in 30 years working the water. When I pushed for more, asking what exactly had made him want off so badly after so short a time, he only said that some places have a feeling to them that gets into a man's sleep whether he wants it there or not. A smart hand, he told me, learns not to ask a platform to explain itself because platforms like this one never gave a straight answer to anybody who asked, and the ones who kept pushing for one tended to regret it eventually. That answer sat with me longer than I wanted it to, especially that night, when the knocking beneath the deck changed pattern for the first time since we had arrived, slowing down, then speeding up, almost like it was listening for something, and adjusting itself to whatever it heard from us. A week into the contract, Dale finally scheduled our first real supply run back to Port Fortune, mostly to restock food and fuel for the generators, and he asked if anyone wanted to ride along for a few hours ashore before we settled into the longer stretch of isolation still ahead of us. Marcus jumped at the chance immediately, saying he wanted to call his mother from somewhere with real cell service instead of the platform's unreliable satellite phone, which dropped calls constantly and made every conversation feel clipped and unfinished. I decided to stay behind with Pop instead, partly to keep working through the maintenance checklist, and partly because something about leaving the platform even briefly felt, for reasons I could not fully explain to myself, like it might somehow make things worse rather than better. That evening, with Dale and Marcus both gone off toward Fortune, and just the two of us left aboard the whole platform, Pop finally opened up a little more than he had all that week, sharing an old story. Offshore men working this particular stretch of the Gulf, he told me quietly, told old stories about certain platforms that nobody wanted to say out loud around new hands who might get spooked easily. He said the stories always followed roughly the same basic shape. A platform that ran fine for years and then, for no clear reason anybody could ever quite point to, started slowly losing men to the water. Those losses always came in threes, always spaced about a month apart from one another, and were always written off afterward as accidents or desertions rather than anything worth investigating closely. I asked him if he believed those stories himself, and he was quiet for a long moment before saying that 30 years on the water taught a man to respect things he could not explain, rather than dismiss them outright the way city folks like to do from a safe distance. Later that night, standing watch on the main deck while Pop slept, I thought I saw something break the surface of the water about 100 yards out, a long dark shape that rose just enough to catch the moonlight before sliding back under without so much as a ripple to mark where it had gone. I told myself it was a shark, or a school of fish moving together, or simply my tired eyes playing tricks on me after a long week of bad sleep and worse dreams, and I did not mention it to Pop or anyone else the next morning. But I found myself checking the water compulsively for the rest of that night, unable to shake the feeling that whatever I had seen out there had been looking back at the platform just as carefully as I had been looking at it. 10 days into the contract, before any of what came later actually started happening in earnest, Dale organized what he called a proper crew dinner, breaking out canned steaks and a bottle of whiskey he had been saving in his cabin for what he described only as a special occasion worth marking. It was, looking back, probably his way of trying to boost morale after a week of odd discoveries and half-answered questions, and for a few hours that evening it almost worked the way he clearly intended it to work for all of us. Marcus told several long, rambling stories that particular evening about growing up poor in Thibodeau, about fishing trips with his father before the man had passed away far too young for anyone liking. Pop, loosened slightly by the whiskey, admitted he had once been married briefly in his 30s before the water took more of his life than his wife had ever been willing to share it with him at all. I found myself talking more than I usually did about Callie, about her hurricane project and her insistence on shark teeth, and for a stretch of maybe 2 hours, the knocking beneath the deck felt like something almost forgettable, background noise easy enough to push aside in decent company. Dale raised a toast at one point during that quiet dinner, thanking all of us sincerely and warmly for taking on such a strange contract without too many hard questions ever being asked of him directly. Pop, raising his own glass a beat later than the rest of us at the table, said quietly that questions left unasked had a way of getting answered anyway, eventually whether a man wanted them to or not. Nobody quite knew what to say to that particular comment right away that evening, and the moment simply passed the way awkward moments often do at a table with enough whiskey already sitting out on it. But I noticed Marcus glance toward the window afterward, toward the dark water outside, in a way that told me the toast had landed with him far more heavily than he ever let on to the rest of us that night. By the end of the second week, I could not let the questions go, so on our next supply run back to Port Fortune, I told Dale I needed a few hours to see my daughter and instead drove straight to the Lafourche Parish Courthouse to pull whatever public records existed on Triton Alpha. The clerk there, a patient woman named Cheryl who had worked the records desk for over 20 years, remembered the platform the moment I said its name, which by itself told me something Dale never had in 3 weeks of vague answers. She pulled a thin folder of permits filed under the old operator, Sabine Delta Petroleum, and inside was a filing from the 3rd of March 2014 describing an uncontrolled formation event during drilling operations on the number 2 well. The report was heavily redacted, blacked out in whole paragraphs by whatever regulatory review had processed it, But the parts left visible mentioned an unusual gas signature and a full evacuation of all 31 personnel within 6 hours of the event beginning that day. I asked Cheryl if she remembered anything from that time that had not made it into the paperwork, and she glanced toward the hallway before leaning closer and telling me her brother-in-law had worked supply boats for Sabine Delta and had refused ever again to run a route near that platform. She said he had never given her a clear reason for it, just that something about the runs out to Triton Alpha in those final months had rattled him badly enough to quit a route that paid better than almost anything else available at the time. I thanked her and asked if the courthouse kept any older records, from before Sabine Delta owned the lease, and she disappeared into a back room for nearly 20 minutes before returning with a much thinner, older folder covered in a fine layer of undisturbed dust. That folder belonged to a different company entirely, a defunct outfit called Continental Bayou Exploration that had operated a platform at almost the exact same coordinates back in the 1970s. Their lease had ended abruptly after an incident report simply labeled equipment failure, with nothing further ever explained anywhere in that thin, dusty file Cheryl had handed across the counter to me. I sat in my truck in the courthouse parking lot for a long time after that, looking at photocopies of documents that raised far more questions than they answered. And I realized I still had 4 hours before I needed to meet the crew boat back at the dock in Forchon. Instead of driving straight back to the dock, I stopped at a bar called the Anchor Room, where Dale once said some old Sabine Delta hands still drank on Friday nights. And there, I found a heavy-set retired driller named Buddy Theriot nursing a beer alone at the counter. Buddy did not want to talk about Triton Alpha at first, waving me off twice before I bought him a second round and told him honestly that I had 4 weeks left of a contract out there and badly needed to know what he knew. He told me the well had not hit a gas pocket the way the official report claimed, and instead the drill bit had broken into something the geologists on site could not classify, a cavity far deeper than any formation on the survey maps. Whatever came about of that cavity afterward, he said, leaning in close enough that I could smell the beer on his breath, was not gas at all. Not in any sense the company's official paperwork had ever tried to pretend it was to state regulators. According to Buddy, 3 men went missing from the platform over the following 2 months before Sabine Delta finally shut the whole operation down for good, quietly and without much explanation given to anyone outside the company. The company told families the men had simply walked off the job, a story nobody who actually worked offshore ever believed for a single second, since men did not walk away from paychecks that size without so much as a phone call home. He said the survivors who came back from that platform were never quite right afterward, jumping at closed doors, refusing to sleep anywhere near open water. One of them eventually committing himself to a facility outside Baton Rouge rather than ever take another job on the Gulf again. I asked him what he thought was actually down there, expecting him to dodge the question the way Dale always had. But instead, he just looked at me for a long moment and said some things that have always been in the ground. Do not appreciate men drilling holes down to where they live quietly. He also told me something that turned my stomach more than anything else that night, that Sabine Delta had never fully capped that well, and what they filed as permanent abandonment was, according to men who worked the actual plug and cementing job, only ever a temporary barrier meant to buy time. Before catching the crew boat back out to the platform that particular day, I made one more stop, driving to the small branch library in La Rose to dig further into whatever older records still existed there. A friendly librarian named Miss Odom kindly helped me search through old newspaper archives on microfilm for anything ever published about Continental Bayou exploration back in the early 1970s. Most of what she found was routine business coverage, quarterly earnings and lease announcements printed in the kind of dry corporate language nobody actually reads unless they are specifically looking for something buried inside it. But one short article from a small Homa paper, dated just weeks after the platform's official abandonment, mentioned in passing that 3 crew members had gone missing during the final month of operations. Their disappearance had been attributed at the time to a possible boating accident during a routine supply run that had gone badly and suddenly wrong out on the open water south of the Louisiana coast. The article named the missing men, a detail Sabine Delta's later paperwork about Triton Alpha had conspicuously never included in anything I had managed to find so far in my own research on this whole ugly situation. I wrote the names down carefully in my notebook, feeling a strange, heavy responsibility settle over me as I did it. like I was the only person left who might ever bother connecting these three names to the two names I already knew from Sabine Delta's era decades later. Miss Odom, watching me work, mentioned almost offhandedly that her own father had briefly worked offshore in that era and had always refused, for reasons he never fully explained to her, to take any job on a platform south of a certain line of longitude he had marked once on an old paper chart. She did not know the specific reason behind his refusal, only that he had grown noticeably uncomfortable whenever the subject came up at family gatherings, changing topics quickly, the way people do when a memory sits too close to something they would rather not examine directly. I thanked her sincerely for all of her help and left the library with photocopies of everything relevant folded carefully into my jacket pocket, driving back slowly toward the dock afterward that day. I felt a growing, uncomfortable sense that this whole pattern stretched back much further than even Buddy or Carol had suggested to me, reaching decades deeper into a history nobody alive had ever fully mapped. Before I left the bar that night, Buddy mentioned one more name, almost as an afterthought. A woman named Carol Gridry, whose husband Everett had once served as a drilling supervisor on that very same platform. She still lived out near Cutoff, he said, according to whatever gossip Buddy had managed to pick up over the years since her husband's mysterious disappearance out there on that open water so long ago. I found her number through an online directory that night, sitting in my truck outside a gas station, and I called her before I could talk myself out of it, explaining as gently as I knew how that I was currently working on the same platform her husband once had. Carol was quiet for a long moment on the other end of the phone line, and then she said quietly that she had wondered for over a decade whether anyone would ever call her about Triton Alpha ever again. The company's lawyers, she told me plainly, had made her sign a thick stack of legal papers years earlier that she still was not entirely sure she had ever fully understood at the time she signed them. She told me Everett had never come home from his final hitch on that platform, and that Sabine Delta's official position was that he had died of a heart attack offshore, though the company had refused, even after repeated requests, to release his body for an independent autopsy of any kind. She said Everett had kept a personal journal throughout his many long years working in the offshore oil industry, a habit that went back to his early days as a young roughneck first starting out on rigs. He had mentioned in his very last letter home something about finally understanding what the old well had actually found buried down beneath it, though he never got the chance to explain further to her. I asked her if she still had that letter, and she said she did, along with the small box of Everett's personal effects the company had eventually shipped back to her, though she had never had the stomach to go through all of it carefully in the years since he passed away. She agreed to mail me photographs of the letter if I gave her an address, and I gave her Dale's post office box in Forshaw since I had nowhere more permanent to offer her at the time. And I thanked her more sincerely than I think she expected from a stranger calling out of nowhere. Driving back to the dock that night with all of that new and heavy information sitting in my chest, I called Renee just to hear Callie's voice for a minute or two before I had to board the boat again. I did not tell either of them anything at all about what I had actually learned that day out there, because I did not yet have any words that would not sound insane coming out of my own mouth to a soul. When I got back aboard the crew boat, Emil asked how my day in town had gone, and something in my face must have given part of it away, because he did not push further, just nodded slowly and told me to be careful out there. The way a man talks to someone he suspects will not listen anyway. 3 days after I got back from Forchon, the first real incident happened, the kind that could no longer be explained away as tired eyes or old equipment settling under normal offshore stress and strain. Marcus was running a routine check on the ballast tanks when he called up over the radio that the access ladder he had climbed down only minutes earlier was no longer where he had left it, the whole section apparently having shifted somehow while he worked below deck alone. Dale dismissed it at first as Marcus simply misremembering which ladder he had used, since there were 2 similar access points close together near that particular tank, but Marcus swore up and down he knew the platform well enough by then not to make that kind of mistake. When I went down to help him back up, using a rope we kept for exactly this sort of contingency, I noticed the ladder in question was indeed bolted several feet from where the maintenance diagrams clearly showed it should have been mounted originally. Pop examined the bolts himself that evening and said flatly that fresh drilling marks in the steel proved someone, or something, had unbolted and remounted that ladder recently, work that would have taken real tools and real time to accomplish properly. None of us had done it, and the 4 of us were the only people aboard the platform. A fact that sat over dinner that night, like a fifth presence nobody wanted to acknowledge out loud in front of the others. 2 nights later, Pop woke the rest of us near 3 in the morning, insisting he had heard footsteps in the corridor outside the crew quarters. Slow and deliberate, pausing outside each door in turn before moving on to the next one down the hall. We searched the entire accessible platform together, all four of us moving as a tight group with flashlights and whatever tools doubled as weapons, and found nothing. No sign of any intruder, no footprints in the light dust coating the walkways. Dale tried to reassure everyone that sound traveled strangely on old steel structures, especially at night when temperature changes caused the metal to contract and groan in ways that could easily mimic footsteps to an anxious, sleep-deprived mind. Marcus wanted to believe him, and for a day or two he seemed to, but I noticed he had started keeping his bedroom door propped shut with a chair wedged beneath the handle every single night after that particular incident occurred. 2 days before Marcus disappeared, Dale called all three of us together in the galley for what he described as a mandatory safety briefing, though it quickly became clear he actually wanted to discuss something else entirely once we had all settled around the small table with our coffee. He told us Calder Meridian's main office had been pushing him hard over the satellite link to accelerate the recommissioning timeline, wanting the platform fully operational 2 full weeks ahead of the original schedule we had all originally agreed to when we signed on for this contract. Marcus asked, reasonably enough, whether that accelerated timeline meant we would finish early and get to go home sooner than originally planned when we had all first signed on to the contract together. Dale admitted, after a long, uncomfortable pause, that it actually meant taking on additional risk by moving forward with pressure testing before certain planned safety inspections had been fully completed. Pop pushed back hard against that idea immediately, saying flatly that pressure testing an old well nobody fully understood, on a schedule dictated by people who had never once set foot on this platform themselves, sounded like exactly the kind of decision that got men killed in this line of work. Dale argued that the additional bonus attached to early completion, an extra $2,000 per man according to the message he had received, made the accelerated timeline worth the modest additional risk involved in moving the schedule forward by 2 weeks. I found myself agreeing with Pop more than I really wanted to admit out loud in front of Dale that particular evening, sitting there quietly in the crowded, dimly lit galley over slowly cooling coffee. Something about the whole conversation felt less like ordinary corporate pressure and more like someone, somewhere, actively wanted that well opened back up as quickly as possible for reasons unexplained. That night, unable to sleep, I found myself thinking again about Voss's line, that the company believed a live connection to the well might someday let them recover something of what had been lost down there decades earlier. I wondered, lying awake and listening to the knocking start its familiar rhythm beneath the deck once again that particular night, whether Calder Meridian actually understood what it was pushing us toward, or maybe they were simply chasing profit margins with no real idea at all what actually weighted down beneath the water. They seemed so eager and willing to reopen on such a rushed, accelerated schedule. Marcus went mostly quiet during that entire tense conversation in the galley, staring down silently into his slowly cooling coffee, and only spoke up once toward the very end of it that particular evening. He asked quietly whether any of us actually still believed the pressure testing schedule had anything at all to do with normal business practices anymore, or whether something else was driving it now. Everything changed for good on what should have been an unremarkable Tuesday, 3 weeks into the contract, when Marcus went down to the cellar deck alone to check a pressure gauge Dale wanted logged before the noon radio call to the mainland office. He never came back up, and when Pop and I went looking for him 20 minutes later, we found his headlamp still burning on the grating near the welded hatch, its beam pointed down into the dark like he had set it down carefully rather than dropped it in any kind of struggle. There was no blood, no sign of a fall, nothing except a smear of something black and faintly glistening along the edge of the grating, thick like tar, but moving in a way tar never moves, retreating slowly from the beam of Pop's flashlight when he swept it across the deck. Dale radioed the mainland immediately, his voice tight and controlled in a way that told me he was working very hard to sound calmer than he actually felt in that moment. And a Coast Guard cutter reached us by early evening. Their search turned up nothing in the water for 100 yards in any direction, no debris, no sign that a man had gone over the side at all, and the crew aboard that cutter looked at each other in a way I recognized from men who had searched this exact water before without success. The investigator who came aboard the next morning, a tired lieutenant named Alvarez, asked the standard questions about harnesses and fatigue, then mentioned twice, almost carefully, that disappearances without recoverable remains were more common in this stretch of the Gulf than people realized. I asked him directly what he meant by that comment, and he gave me a long, measured look before saying only that some parts of the water had a reputation among search and rescue crews that never quite made it into any official incident report filed with the Coast Guard. After Alvarez left, Dale tried to hold the three of us together with talk about finishing the contract for Marcus's sake, some idea about honoring his memory by completing what he had started, but Pop had already begun packing a bag without waiting to hear the rest of it. Pop told him flatly that he had seen this exact pattern before, decades earlier, and that he was not staying around to watch it happen a second time in one lifetime just because a contract said he owed the company 2 more weeks of his labor. That night, the knocking beneath the deck grew louder than it had ever been, no longer confined to the risers but seeming to come from everywhere at once, from the legs, from the cellar deck, even from inside the walls of the crew quarters where no pipe or riser had any business running at all. I found Pop standing at the rail near dawn, staring at the water where the platform's shadow fell long and black across the surface, and he told me, in a voice stripped of its gruffness, that he had seen something rise partway out of that shadow 20 years earlier before it sank back under. He described it as a shape too long for anything that swims, moving in sections like a chain being pulled slowly through the water. And the worst part, he said, was not the shape itself, but the sound it made. A low, resonant hum matching, almost exactly, the knocking under the deck. Dale wanted to wait for the next scheduled supply run before evacuating, worried about the cost of an emergency pull-off and what it would mean for the remaining balance of the contract with Calder Meridian. But Pop told him plainly that money would do a dead man no good at all out here. That argument was still going when the platform's main power flickered and died without warning, plunging the control room into total darkness except for weak battery lighting. And through the window, I watched the derrick's warning beacon go dark, along with everything else on board. In that sudden blackness, I heard something scrape against the underside of the heli deck directly above us. A long, dragging sound followed by a wet, heavy thud that seemed to shake the whole platform down through its steel bones and into the water below us. Dale grabbed the emergency radio and started transmitting a mayday, his voice cracking on the platform's coordinates, while Pop pressed his back against the wall near the door, with the wrench he always kept close, now gripped white-knuckled in his hand. I remember thinking, in the strange, clear way a person's mind works when it finally accepts real danger, that whatever had taken Marcus was not finished with the rest of us yet, and that the sound climbing toward the helideck stairs was coming for the control room next. We stayed pressed against that wall for what felt like an hour, but was probably closer to 20 minutes, listening to something enormous move slowly across the deck above our heads, testing doors and hatches with a patience that felt almost curious rather than purely hungry or aggressive. When the sound finally receded back toward the water, none of us moved for a long time afterward, and Dale's mayday call, still transmitting on repeat into the dark, was the only sound left in that room besides our own ragged breathing. Dawn came slow that morning, gray and reluctant, and none of us had slept more than a few stolen minutes propped against the control room wall with whatever tools we could reach serving as poor substitutes for actual weapons. Dale kept checking the radio every few minutes, repeating the mayday call and our coordinates in a voice that had gone hoarse from hours of transmitting into what felt increasingly like an empty, indifferent silence out there on the water. Around 7 in the morning, Pop insisted we move to the heli deck to signal any passing aircraft directly, reasoning that visual contact might succeed where radio calls apparently had not, and the three of us climbed the stairs together in a tight, watchful group. From the helideck we could see, faint against the horizon, what looked like the running lights of a vessel still miles out, moving slowly in our general direction, but giving no clear indication of whether it had actually received Dale's repeated distress calls at all. While we waited, Pop noticed something on the deck plating near the stairwell we had climbed only minutes earlier, a wide smear of the same black, faintly glistening substance we had found near Marcus's headlamp, still fresh enough to catch the early morning light. He knelt down beside it without touching anything, studying the pattern of the smear the way a tracker studies a trail, and told us it led directly toward the stairwell, down into the cellar deck rather than away from it toward open water. That detail unsettled me more than almost anything else that morning, since it suggested whatever had moved across our platform overnight had not simply retreated into the sea, the way Pop's earlier story had led me to expect from something living mostly in the water. Dale radioed the approaching vessel one more time, and this time, a voice crackled back, faint but unmistakably human, confirming they had received our mayday and were making best possible speed toward our coordinates from a position roughly 2 hours out. Those 2 hours felt longer than the entire 3 weeks that had come before them. Every distant clang of metal against metal sending all three of us reaching for whatever was nearest at hand. Every shift in the wind carrying sounds that may or may not have actually been there at all. Pop said we should not waste those 2 hours sitting idle on an open helideck, and that if we were going to survive long enough to actually reach that boat, we needed to understand exactly what we were dealing with before it came back for the rest of us. We used the sealed hatch near the base of the derrick that the old crew had not bothered welding shut, likely because it led only to a cramped equipment locker rather than down toward the well bore itself, where the real danger apparently lived. Inside, behind a stack of rusted tool crates, Dale's flashlight caught the edge of a metal strongbox, its lock long since seized with corrosion, and Pop pried it open with a crowbar to reveal a bundle of waterlogged papers wrapped in plastic. That plastic sleeve had somehow kept most of the pages legible despite years of humidity, and the papers turned out to be the journal of a Sabine Delta drilling supervisor named Everett Voss, the same man whose widow Carol had spoken to me about only days earlier back on land. Reading it by flashlight in that cramped locker, with something enormous still possibly moving somewhere out on the deck above us, was the closest thing to a confession any of us would ever get about what this platform actually was. Voss wrote that the well had broken into what geological surveys later classified as an impossibly old cavity system, sealed beneath the seabed for longer than the company's own scientists were willing to estimate out loud in any official report filed afterward. According to his account, whatever lived down in that cavity had been disturbed by drilling operations decades earlier at a different platform entirely, the same Continental Bayou exploration site I had read about in the courthouse records only days before. That earlier platform had been abandoned in the 1970s after a blowout the company managed to keep entirely out of the papers, paying off enough people and burying enough paperwork that almost no public trace of it survived into the present day. Voss believed the entity, if that was even the right word for something with no name in any language he had access to, did not attack out of simple hunger the way survivors' stories always implied afterward. Instead, he wrote, it operated on some older, more patient logic, marking certain platforms as connected to itself, the way a spider marks the edges of its web with careful, deliberate threads of silk stretched out over years. He wrote that the disappearances followed a pattern nobody at the company wanted to acknowledge in writing, always coming in threes, always spaced roughly a month apart, always preceded by knocking sounds that grew louder and more insistent as the date approached. Voss described the knocking in almost exactly the same terms Pop had used only days earlier, a rhythmic sound that traveled through the platform's steel legs rather than through the air, changing tempo whenever it seemed to notice it was being listened to by someone aboard. Most disturbing of all, Voss's final entries described a growing certainty that the thing was not simply killing the missing men, but somehow using them, folding them into itself in ways he never managed to explain clearly on the page. This, he believed, was the actual reason Sabine Delta never fully capped the well, because company engineers thought a live connection might someday let them recover something of what had been lost down there. Voss also wrote about a company geologist named Harmon who had theorized, based on core samples taken before the blowout, that the cavity extended far beyond the boundaries of any single lease, possibly connecting to several other formations scattered across this stretch of the Gulf entirely. If Harmon's theory was correct, Voss wrote, then capping one well would never actually solve anything, since whatever lived down there could simply wait, patient as stone, for the next company to come along and drill a new opening somewhere else along its reach. The last page, dated 3 days before the platform's evacuation, was smeared with something dark that had dried stiff into the paper, and it ended mid-sentence with the words, "The knocking has started again, and I know now that I am the third." Pop set the journal down with hands that were not quite steady, and for a long moment nobody in that cramped equipment locker said anything at all, the flashlight beams just trembling slightly against the walls around us. tucked into the very back of Voss's journal, folded away separately from the rest of the main pages, was a hand-drawn map showing what he simply labeled known sites, spread out across the whole coastline. It marked 6 separate locations across a rough hand-drawn outline of the Gulf coastline, stretching from somewhere near Corpus Christi all the way east toward the distant Mississippi River Delta itself. 3 of the marks were labeled with dates decades apart, the earliest reading 1931 in faded pencil, suggesting whatever Voss had come to understand about this thing predated even the Continental Bayou platform by more than 40 years of quiet, patient activity beneath the water. Beside each marked site, he had written a single word or short phrase, dormant beside 2 of them, active beside the third one located much further down the coastline toward the east that particular year. Beside the site corresponding exactly to Triton Alpha's own coordinates, he had written only the single word feeding, underlined twice hard enough to nearly tear straight through the old brittle paper. Pop studied that hand-drawn map for a long, quiet time in complete silence, tracing each individual mark carefully with one finger before he finally spoke again to all the rest of us gathered there closely. If Voss had been right about even half of what this old map suggested, he said quietly, then Sabine Delta's blowout had not created anything new so much as simply reopened an old, existing connection. He pointed next to the site nearest the Mississippi Delta, unlabeled except for a single question mark, and said quietly that a man could spend his entire remaining life chasing down this one thing alone. A person could spend years tracking down every platform, every drilling lease, every quiet company failure scattered across this whole stretch of water and still never fully map out the true shape of it. Dale, reading over our shoulders, asked the question that had clearly been sitting with him since we first opened the strongbox, wanting to know whether Voss's journal offered anything resembling an actual method for stopping the thing, rather than simply cataloging where it had already been. Pop turned back to the final pages of the journal once more, searching carefully, and found only a single fragmentary line written near the very end of Voss's own shaky, badly deteriorating handwriting. It was written in a hand far less steady than all the earlier entries, reading something must be given back for something taken, though Voss never got the chance to explain what that trade looked like. We all understood, without needing to say a single word of it aloud to each other, that Marcus's disappearance had almost certainly started the same countdown Voss once described in his final journal entries. We had perhaps 30 days left to us, or far less given how quickly the knocking had already escalated overnight before it finally finished its business, with the rest of us still aboard that platform. Dale, still holding the flashlight with a hand that shook slightly, asked the question none of us had wanted to voice yet, wondering aloud whether leaving the platform now, mid-contract, would actually stop whatever had already been set into motion the moment Marcus went missing that Tuesday. Pop said he honestly did not know, since nothing in Voss's journal addressed what happened to men who left before the pattern completed itself, only what happened to the ones who stayed until the third disappearance came due on schedule. I thought then about the letter Carol Guidry had promised to mail me, still sitting somewhere in a post office box back in Forchon, and I wondered what else Everett Voss might have written in those final pages, before whatever took him finally caught up with the rest of his crew. Something small in the strong box caught my eye then. A second smaller envelope tucked away carefully beneath where the journal itself had been resting quietly for all these years, completely undisturbed. Inside were more old photographs. 6 men standing together in coveralls in front of a crane, the exact same pose as the photograph Marcus had found back in our storage locker only a week before that night. On the back, in handwriting I recognized from the journal, Voss had written the single line, a note to whoever might find this after him, saying the platform kept its own records if you knew where to look for them properly. Pop turned the photograph over twice, studying the 6 faces in the fading light, and said quietly that this was not the first crew, and it would not be the last one either, unless somebody finally found a way to actually stop what lived beneath this water for good. Dale did not answer him, and neither did I, because outside, faint but unmistakable, the knocking had started again, closer now than it had been even an hour earlier. And none of us wanted to be the one to point that out loud in that small, cramped room. We did not wait around inside that cramped equipment locker once the knocking started closing distance, and Dale led us back up through the platform toward the heli deck, moving fast but careful, checking every corner before we committed to crossing it in the open. The vessel Dale, had finally reached over the radio. That gray, uncertain dawn turned out to be a supply boat working under Emil's command. The same captain who had first ferried us out to Triton Alpha. He was, apparently, the only man working anywhere out of Forshan willing to answer an emergency call sent to these particular coordinates on such short notice, so very early in the morning like that. Getting down the stairs to the boat landing felt like the longest 10 minutes of my life. Every clang of our boots against the steel grating sounding in my head, exactly like the knocking that had been building under that platform for weeks on end. Emil did not ask questions when we came aboard looking the way we did, hollow-eyed and moving too fast for men supposedly evacuating over routine equipment failure, and he simply pushed the throttle forward the moment the last line was clear of the platform. Dale stood at the stern for a long while, watching Triton Alpha shrink behind us against the flat, gray morning. And I noticed his hands were still shaking, even after we had put a good half-mile of open water between ourselves and the platform's rusted legs. Pop went below to the small cabin and did not come back up on deck for the rest of the trip, saying only that he intended to keep his eyes on something other than water for as long as he possibly could manage that morning. I stayed up top with Dale, partly to keep watch and partly because some instinct told me that whatever we were leaving behind out there might not consider a half-mile of distance particularly meaningful to whatever timescale it actually operated on. About halfway back to Port Fortune, with the platform finally out of sight behind the curve of the horizon, the boat's engine sputtered once, unevenly, and died completely for almost 30 seconds before Emil managed to get it running again with a string of muttered curses under his breath. In that half-minute of drifting silence, with only the sound of water slapping against the hull, I thought I heard something answering back from below the surface, a low resonant hum matching almost exactly the same pitch as the knocking we had left behind us on the platform. Dale heard it too. I could tell from the way his whole body went rigid at the rail, and Emil, working the ignition with quick, practiced hands, told us both flatly not to look at the water and to keep our eyes fixed on the horizon ahead of us instead. The engine caught again just as something long and pale broke the surface, perhaps 40 yards off our port side. There and gone again in under 2 seconds, too brief for me to be certain of anything I thought I had actually seen out there. Nobody spoke again until the coastline finally came into clear view nearly an hour later. A thin, gray line on the horizon that slowly resolved into the familiar shapes of cranes and storage tanks lining the industrial waterfront at Port Fortune. Pop finally spoke again once we were close enough to see individual boats moving along the docks, saying that in his experience these things did not always stay contained to the platform where they first took root in the seabed below. Leaving Triton Alpha behind, he said, might not be the same as leaving whatever actually lived beneath it behind us for good, and I found myself wanting badly to believe he was simply wrong about that particular point. Something in the back of my mind kept returning to the exact rhythm of that knocking anyway. A rhythm I found myself tapping absently against the boat's railing without meaning to, all the way until we finally reached the dock. Dale never spoke to any of us again after we reached the dock, disappearing into whatever arrangement Calder Meridian had for men who came back from a job with more questions than answers. And when I tried calling the number on his old contract, it rang through to a disconnection message. I drove out to that Lafayette address listed on the old contract 2 weeks later, curious enough to make the trip myself despite everything that had already happened to the four of us out there together. There, I found exactly what Cheryl back at the courthouse had already warned me about weeks earlier. A small law office with no record of any company called Calder Meridian Holdings leasing any space here. The receptionist, a young woman who seemed genuinely confused by my questions, told me the office had handled paperwork for dozens of shell entities over the years, and could not possibly track which ones had come and gone through their address at any given time. I called the emergency contact number Dale had given us for reporting Marcus's disappearance to his family, hoping to at least confirm someone had followed up properly with his mother in Thibodaux, and instead reached another disconnection message identical to the one I had gotten calling Dale. I drove out to Thibodaux myself the following weekend and found Marcus's mother still waiting for any official word about her son, having received only a brief, impersonal letter from Calder Meridian expressing regret over what it called an unfortunate workplace accident. She had not received a body, had not received an explanation, and had not received the second half of Marcus's contracted pay that he had been counting on to help cover her ongoing medical bills at the hospital in Homa. I gave her what little money I could spare that day, along with everything I actually knew about Triton Alpha. Though watching her face while I explained it made me wish I had found some gentler way to deliver news that could not, by its nature, be delivered gently to anyone. She thanked me anyway through tears and told me she had always known in her heart something was wrong the moment Dale's offer arrived, but that some choices only look foolish after the fact, once a person no longer has the luxury of choosing anything different. Pop drove north the same day we got back to Fort John, telling me only that he intended to stay as far from open water as a man his age could reasonably manage for whatever years he still had left in him. He left me his number scrawled on the napkin at the diner where we said goodbye, and for the first few weeks after everything happened, I called him almost every night, mostly just to hear another voice that had actually been there and would not tell me I was imagining things. Those calls got shorter and shorter over time, then less and less frequent still, until eventually Pop simply stopped answering the phone altogether. No matter how many times I kept trying to call him, I never learned whether that was because something had actually happened to him out there, or simply because he had finally found the distance from all of it that he had been chasing since we left the platform behind us for good. I tried, in those first difficult weeks, to get somebody official to take the whole story seriously, starting with a call to the regional agency that oversaw offshore drilling permits across the Gulf. A bored-sounding clerk on the other end of the line took down my complaint and told me someone would follow up within 30 business days if the situation actually warranted further attention from anyone. Nobody ever called me back. And when I followed up myself a month later, a different employee told me there was no record of any complaint filed under my name, though I had written down the confirmation number myself at the time of the original call. I tried a local television reporter next, a woman named Denise Arsenault, who had done a segment years earlier on offshore safety violations, and she met me for coffee in Homa and listened to the whole story with what seemed like genuine, careful attention. She called me back a week later, sounding genuinely apologetic, and explained that her editor had killed the story after receiving a call from a media relations firm she had never once heard of before. That firm specialized, according to her own careful research done afterward, almost exclusively in representing companies nobody could ever quite trace back to an actual living owner anywhere on paper. I understood then, in a way I had not fully grasped before that moment, that whatever protected Triton Alpha was not simply careless bureaucracy or corporate indifference of the ordinary, everyday kind. It was something closer to active, deliberate effort instead, spread out across enough different hands that no single person involved could ever be blamed for the whole of it by anyone looking closely. Carol Guidry's letter from Everett arrived around that same time, forwarded from Dale's old post office box by someone at the Postal Service who had apparently found no other address to send it to once the box itself was closed. The letter itself said little I did not already know from reading the journal closely before that day. Mostly just an ordinary man's plain, aching worry for the wife he had left waiting back home in cutoff. But one line near the very bottom of the page stopped me cold, where he had written that he hoped whoever eventually read this letter would have better luck walking away than he ever managed to have himself. I spent the money, all of it, on Callie's braces and the truck payments and 6 months of breathing room I badly needed. And for a while, I told myself that whatever the platform had been, it was behind me the same way every hard contract falls behind a man who keeps moving forward. I found steady work with a marine supply company in Homa, nothing offshore, nothing that would ever again put me more than a short drive from dry land, and Renee noticed the difference in me, even though I never told her the real reason behind the change. Callie got her braces off eventually, on schedule, and I made sure to be there for that appointment, standing in the waiting room with a bouquet of grocery store flowers that made her roll her eyes even as she smiled at me for bringing them anyway that day. For almost a year, life settled into something close to ordinary again, the kind of quiet, unremarkable routine I had spent most of my adult life either chasing or running from, depending on which particular week you happened to catch me in. I thought about Pop sometimes, wondering if he had found whatever distance he had been looking for, and I thought about Marcus's mother more often than that, wondering how she was managing without the money her son had died trying to provide for her care. I never heard anything further from Calder Meridian Holdings, never received the second half of my contracted pay that I was technically still owed, and I decided fairly quickly that chasing down that particular debt was not worth whatever attention it might draw back toward me and my daughter. Carol Guidry called me twice, more over that year, mostly just to talk. Two people bound together by something neither of us fully understood, but both of us needed occasionally to speak about out loud to somebody who would not think we had lost our minds entirely. She told me during that second phone call that she had finally sold Everett's old truck, the last real thing of his she had been holding on to for all those long, difficult years since he first disappeared. Doing so had felt less like letting go of him completely, she explained quietly, and more like finally admitting to herself that some part of him had never actually come home from that platform at all. Then, almost 14 months after we left Triton Alpha behind for good, another message arrived completely out of nowhere. This time from a recruiter I had never once heard of before, that particular day. It represented a company called Viridian Sabine Resources, offering an almost identical contract on a platform with a different name sitting in almost exactly the same coordinates south of Port Fortune. The email used language I recognized instantly, phrases about self-sufficiency and limited communication that echoed Dale's original offer closely enough that my hands were shaking slightly by the time I finished reading it through twice at my kitchen table. I did not respond right away, and instead I spent that whole long weekend digging carefully into Meridian Sabine Resources, the exact same way I had once dug into Calder Meridian Holdings a year earlier. I started with a basic search of the state's business filings before moving on carefully to whatever additional public records I could still manage to access from home on my own laptop computer that weekend. The company had been registered only 8 months earlier, its listed address belonging to yet another small law office, this one located out Baton Rouge rather than in Lafayette this time around, oddly. The registered agent's name, though, matched almost exactly a name I remembered seeing buried somewhere deep inside Calder Meridian's own original filing paperwork from years before all of this happened. I called the LaForge Parish Courthouse and asked to speak with Cheryl again, and she remembered me immediately, telling me she had actually been half expecting my call ever since a colleague mentioned a new drilling application had come through for a platform in roughly that same stretch of water. She pulled the new filing for me over the phone, reading off details that matched Triton Alpha's original permits closely enough to leave no real doubt in my mind that this was, functionally, the same operation simply wearing a different corporate name this time around. I thanked her and hung up, sitting alone in my apartment for a long while afterward, turning the whole situation over in my head the way a man turns over a stone he already suspects has something ugly living underneath it. Part of me wanted to warn somebody, anybody, though I already knew from hard experience exactly how far that kind of warning would actually travel before it hit a wall built specifically to stop it from spreading any further than it already had. Another part of me, a part I was not particularly proud of admitting even to myself that quiet evening, noticed the number attached to the new contract, which was larger even than the last one had ever been. I understood with sick, sudden clarity exactly why men like Marcus and men very much like myself kept answering these calls, no matter how many warning signs stood in plain view along the way each time. I have not answered that new offer yet, and some nights I convince myself I never will, no matter how badly the number attached to it still tempts me on the nights when money feels tight again lately. But other nights, lying awake in the dark with Callie asleep down the hall in her own room, I catch myself listening for a particular rhythm in the pipes of my own house, a slow, patient knocking. I am no longer entirely sure I only imagine hearing there. It started small, maybe 2 months after I got back from Fortune that first time. A faint tapping in the bathroom wall I told myself was old plumbing settling the way old houses always do in humid climates like this one along the Gulf Coast. Renee mentioned it once, too, during a visit to drop Callie off after a weekend, saying she thought she heard something knocking softly behind the wall near the water heater, though she laughed it off as nothing worth calling a plumber about at the time. I did not laugh it off, not really, though I made sure my face did not show that to either of them, and I found myself standing in that bathroom alone more nights than I would ever admit to anyone who asked me directly about it. Callie asked me once, a few months back, why I sometimes got quiet and far away looking when we were doing something ordinary together, watching television or eating dinner at the kitchen table like any other family in Homa might do on any given evening. I told her I was just tired from work, which was not entirely a lie, though it was not the whole truth either. And she seemed to accept the answer the easy way children accept most explanations adults give them without much real scrutiny. Some nights when the knocking behind the walls started up right on schedule, I found myself doing math I did not want to be doing, counting backward from the last time I had heard it, wondering how many days had passed since the pattern had last reset itself around me. I never told Renee about Marcus, about Pop, about the journal or the photographs or any of the rest of it, because I still did not have words for any of that which would not sound like the ravings of a man who badly needed professional help of some kind. About 6 months after the new offer first arrived in my inbox, I ran into Buddy Theriot again, purely by chance, standing in line at a hardware store in Homa buying supplies for a small repair project. The conversation turned, as it always seemed to eventually with the two of us these days whenever we happened to speak, back toward the water and everything that still lived beneath it out past the coast. He told me he had heard through the same loose network of retired offshore men who still traded gossip over beers at places like the Anchor Room. Something troubling that had happened just weeks earlier. A small platform operating under yet another unfamiliar company name had reportedly a worker missing somewhere south of Forchon, according to whatever second-hand version of the story had reached him. Nobody Buddy talked to could confirm the exact coordinates of that missing worker, and the story had barely made local news before disappearing entirely from whatever attention it might briefly have gathered. It got buried beneath larger stories about hurricane season and an upcoming election that mattered more to most people than one missing roughneck nobody outside his own family seemed to know or care about. I told Buddy about Meridian Sabine Resources, about the registered agent whose name matched Calder Meridian's old paperwork, and he went quiet for a long moment before saying only that some things learn how to keep working long after the people who started them have moved on or died off. He asked if I intended to say anything at all to anyone official about it, and I found I honestly did not have a good enough answer ready for him that particular afternoon standing there in the checkout line. Every attempt I had already made to raise the alarm had simply vanished into the same kind of silence that had apparently swallowed both Everett Boss and Marcus Boudreaux before me, completely and quietly. Buddy said he understood that particular silence better than most people ever could, having lived inside it himself for well over a decade now since his own time working offshore finally ended for good. He told me the hardest part was never really the fear itself, but the slow, grinding guilt of knowing something true and doing essentially nothing meaningful with that knowledge ever afterward at all. I drove home that evening turning his words over in my head, wondering whether writing everything down somewhere, in detail, and leaving it for someone else to eventually find, might be the closest thing to actually doing something that a man in my position could reasonably manage at this point. That is, in the end, part of why I'm telling this now. Not because I expected to change anything meaningful about what is still out there working its patient way, through men who need money badly enough to stop asking careful questions. 2 nights ago, the knocking behind the bathroom wall changed rhythm for the first time since it started, slowing down, then speeding up, in the exact pattern Pop had once described hearing out on the platform right before everything with Marcus finally happened. I stood in that dark hallway for a long time, listening. Callie asleep down the hall, and Renee's number sitting unanswered on my phone screen because I genuinely did not know yet what I would even say to her if she picked up the call. I thought about Everett Voss's last journal entry, about the knocking has started again, and I know now that I am the third. And I found myself doing the same grim arithmetic he must have done in his final days out there on that platform, alone with numbers that refused to add up to anything hopeful. I do not know for certain whether whatever lives beneath Triton Alpha can actually follow a man home the way Pop once warned me it might, or whether this is simply what a mind does to itself after enough sleepless nights spent circling the same unanswerable questions without any real relief. What I do know is that the recruiter's email is still sitting unopened in a folder on my phone, the number attached to it larger than anything Calder Meridian ever offered me. Arriving at almost exactly the moment my truck needs a transmission repair I genuinely cannot otherwise afford this month. I have started leaving the bathroom light on at night, a small, useless habit that does nothing to actually quiet the sound, but somehow makes the waiting easier to bear until morning finally comes and ordinary daylight makes the whole thing feel, briefly, almost survivable again. Some nights I tell myself I will call Carol Grittery in the morning, tell her everything about the new contract, ask her whatever it would have wanted a stranger in my position to do with knowledge like this weighing on him. Other nights lying there quietly listening to that patient, familiar rhythm working its way slowly through the pipes of my own darkened house. I find myself wondering something else entirely instead. I wonder whether the actual choice was ever really mine to make in the first place. Or whether men like me simply get chosen long before we ever notice the knocking has already started counting us in.